All right, I am excited. I'm a little starstruck this morning because I get to have like elk royalty on the podcast. Corey Jacobson, how you doing?
I am great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on, man. I've got some elk hunts this year, and I was talking to my friends who had a connection with you, and I said, man, I'd love to get Corey on just to give me insight on over the counter elk hunting in Colorado and what that looks like, and we'll see where this thing takes us. But I'm sure you've got a bunch of great stuff to share with us when it comes to elk and predators and all that stuff.
Man, I can always make up great stuff for sure when it comes
That's
to elk hunting.
yeah, you got to fake it till you make it, right?
That's
So,
right.
someday you'll make it.
I'm
Um,
hoping.
so Corey, I guess give us like the 1,000 foot view of you. You live up in Idaho. How long you been hunting elk? And who's Corey Jacobson? For those who don't
Yeah.
know.
No, I grew up in Idaho. Uh, Over the counter public land elk hunting is, that's what I cut my teeth on, and it's still my bread and butter and what I love to do each fall. So I was blessed. I grew up in elk country. So I started elk hunting at a young age. Got my first elk tag when I was 12, which was the legal age to hunt in Idaho back then. And I don't think I've missed an elk season since. So, just I still consider myself just a regular guy who likes to go out and grind on public land with over the counter tags. And obviously, there's other opportunities that come up. I have points in several states, but at the end of the day, what I really look forward to is just going out and getting deep in the backcountry and looking for elk with the rest of the public land elk hunters.
Yeah, it's that time of year right now where everyone's just jonesing, right, to get out and go hunting. All you can do is think about hunting and getting out there. And I always joke with my wife because by the time like December comes along, I'm so tired. Like I'm not tired of hunting, but I'm tired because I'm hunting so much. But
Totally.
I have to, I have to tell myself like you're come, June, you're gonna be wishing you were out here. But
Yep.
yeah, there is something special about doing it. There's something special about the public lands and doing it. Even the over the counter stuff. Um, I have people ask me a lot. Hey, you want to come hunt this property with me? And it doesn't really seem appealing to me, right? Like I'm going to Maui. It's going to be a fun hunt. We're going to go kill some axis deer, but it's almost like I'm going to kill some deer thing,
Yeah.
right? Like I know I'm going to go over there and kill some deer, which is awesome. It's a cool experience, but man, like chasing elk on public land, like that seems like a challenge to me. And that's what I really want to get better at. Like we've been involved and killed a handful of bulls now, a lot of cows. I've never killed a bull with my bow. I've never even pursued him with my bow. Um, but that challenge really intrigues me. The archery side really intrigues me. The kill doesn't really intrigue me so much anymore. I've killed a bunch of animals now with my rifle, and I really want to get into archery stuff. So that's why I was wanted to bring you on and kind of give me that insight, man. When did you pick up
Yeah.
a bow?
I started shooting a bow when I was 7. I got my first compound bow when I was 8. It was a old Martin Bobcat, had the wood riser, and transitioned from that into a Martin Firecat. And so that was back, early mid 80s, probably 1983, 1984. And I've just been absolutely in love with archery and bow hunting since. In addition to when it comes to elk, I think archery is actually, I wouldn't say easier, but it's more enjoyable. I think it's a little bit easier to find animals and interact with them. So the combination of archery and elk hunting kind of just got in my blood from a young age, and there's nothing that I look forward to in hunting more than September with a bow.
Gotcha. So me going into it, where do you want to go with it? You want to go straight into public land, go into Colorado? I got point crept. I think I told you this. I
Yeah,
had 7 points. I really wanted my first elk experience to be one where I had just bulls bugling the whole time and just lots of elk. So I had a great unit in Colorado. It took 7 points to draw and go hunt, and 32 of the 35 people who applied to 7 points did not draw. We all got point crept. So
wow.
now we do it again next year with 8 points, and I'll probably get point crept again because it seems like that's the going trend right now with point creep, right? Because that means the 32 more guys putting in for it next year. So I'm going to go public land. I'm gonna go. No, everything's public land. I'm gonna go over the counter, Colorado. I've got a few units I've been looking at that are a little bit, that seem better. Just go on looking at success rates, looking at public land ratios. Where do I start? What do I expect? I had Clint Casper on yesterday, and he's like, "Dude, don't even bring calls. Don't even worry about it. Just sit in public land. They're not going to be calling anyways. Just sit wallows. You could try and call a little bit." And then I told him you were coming on. He's like, "Oh, Corey's going to tell you to call the whole time, run and gun."
Yeah, no, and really you have to adapt to what you're given, the situation you're given. And I drew a unit in Colorado a couple of years ago. I burned I think 17, 18 points at the time. And like you said, point creep is real. When I started putting in for Colorado, this was, early 2000s, 2002, 2003, something like that. The best units in Colorado, a non-resident could draw with 8, 9, maybe 10 points.
Mhm.
And so when I started putting in, it's like, hey, that's my goal. I'm going to draw the best unit in Colorado when I get to 10 points. And then I got to 10 points and I could barely draw a medium level draw hunt in Colorado. So point creep is real, especially in Colorado. I think we're going to see it get a lot worse. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg for, you looked and it took 7 points. You didn't draw with 7 points. Sound like only 3 people with 7 points did draw. And next year, depending on how many tags there are in that unit, a few more of those are going to get pulled out of the top point pool. But more and more people with more points are going to start putting in for those hunts. And so I hunted a really good unit, but there was a lot of private land that we don't have. We didn't have access to it. We were on the public land, and it limited us to where we could go. So you really have to look at: am I able to just run and gun? Am I stuck on a border, on the public private land border? Are the elk bugling? Do I get a hunt during the rut? And then it goes to Colorado over the counter public land. Those elk definitely see a lot of pressure. So there are places where the elk are a lot more call shy and less likely to respond and come into calls. With that being said, even in the most heavily hunted areas, anytime during the month of September, I'm still going to have calls. I might not rely on them near as much as I do in other areas, different times of the month, but I'm always going to have calls because calls are going to be effective. It just might not be the aggressive, in your face, run and gun type of calling that I love to do. But there's always an opportunity to utilize calls to help us be successful.
Okay, so now I'm just selfishly having you on just to tell me about my hunt. I'm I'm planning on going. The season starts September 2nd. I'm planning on being there like August, whatever, 30th or 31st, how many days in that month? 2 days early, and being there for at least 10 days in the first part of season. I know that's not necessarily peak rut time, but I kind of figure with pressure, maybe it'll be a little better for me, and it kind of fits my schedule better. So this unit I'm looking at, it does have some private, not a lot. There's a ton of public, a lot of roads, so it's gonna be hard for me to get away from roads. How when you say run and gun, let's talk about that. Like, what do you? I'm going there September 2nd, opening day. What are you doing?
Man, I mean, you really have the deck stacked against you. You're in Colorado. You're over the counter tag. You're public land. You're in an area where there's a lot of roads, so it's hard to get away and find unpressured elk. You're hunting early season before they really start calling, rutting,
Mhm.
gathering cows. So you got a lot going against you. With that said, you have the benefit of those elk not being harassed for the past 24 days, which when somebody hunts the last week, those elk have heard every call. They've smelled every person in the woods. They know where their sanctuaries are and they're going to go there and they know how to play the cat and mouse game of staying alive. And so, there's that benefit. The other thing is, I believe that first week of September, the moon phase is pretty good. You get into a highly pressured elk with a full moon before the rut really kicks in, and that can be a tough elk to hunt. So you had a couple of positives there that you definitely want to leverage. As far as pressure and the road systems, and they're not knowing the exact unit or all the logistics there, when there's a lot of roaded access, you can expect that there's going to be hunting pressure. You're hunting over Labor Day weekend, it sounds like. So there's going to be a lot of people out in the woods camping. So you're going to have to find areas where you can still get away from roads, but also utilize the road systems to your advantage. And one of the things I like to do is I like to be mobile. And if I'm in an area where there's a lot of roads, if you can't get more than 2, 3 miles off of a road, you're
Mhm.
probably going to be able to go and find elk at night from the road. And again, realizing when you let out a bugle, you might have to stand there for 20 minutes and bugle 5 or 6 times in the dark before you even get a response. And when you do get a response, it's probably not going to be a real aggressive, come and get me type of response, but it'll help you at least be able to locate elk and know where to go the next day. So that would be a strategy that I use, and that's people, you see both sides of the spectrum there where people will use roads. They'll pull up with their windows down and music blasting in their diesel truck, and they'll get out, and 6 seconds after the diesel engine shuts off, they blow a bugle, and elk are able to correlate that, and they know eventually, hey, there's a road there, there's a truck there, that's danger. A bugle just came from there. Something doesn't seem right. And so that, kind of contributes to the elk becoming a little bit more call shy and a little bit less likely to answer and then come into calls. So it's important to, get out, hike down the ridge 300 yards from the vehicle, sit there and listen for 5 minutes, and then let out just a soft location bugle trying to get a response. And then, don't bugle 6 times in the first 2 minutes, stand there for 10 minutes. Let the elk get curious. Let the elk realize, hey, things have settled down. Then you let out another bugle. And all you're trying to do is just find an elk to respond to you. Keep in mind, do your e-scouting, know where pockets are where you're likely to find elk grouped up when they start getting pressured, and make sure you don't just go and, at nighttime after dark, stand on a ridge with the wind going right down into the basin that you want to hunt the next morning. Have a strategy of your mobility at night and where you want to go. Good vantage points where you can bugle and access a lot of country with your bugle, realizing that all you're trying to do is locate those elk. And then once you locate them, you want to have a plan to come in that next morning and get into where those elk were. Because if there's a lot of roads and you can't get more than a mile or two off of a road before you bump into another road, even if it's a gated road that you can't drive down, roads are still, they can provide kind of a boundary for those elk, and they know that
Mhm.
there's going to be more pressure, more activity, and they're going to want to stay away from those road systems. Generally speaking, that doesn't mean you won't get an elk to bugle from the middle of a main gravel road, or you won't have elk crossing a main gravel road to go from feed to bedding. But generally speaking, they're gonna recognize where activity and where pressure is coming from. So that would be kind of my starting game plan. Definitely do all your e-scouting, identify pockets where there are likely to be elk, but then don't just go and put all your eggs in one basket and spend 8 days hunting that one basin where you thought there
Mhm.
should be elk. Go and find the elk.
Yeah, so I got a few things on that. One, on the spending 8 days in one basin, I've done that to myself before where I've pigeonholed myself, and, like, especially on seasons like I did in Oregon where it's a 5-day season, and I blew the first 3 days hiking down into the bottom of a canyon, and then there were no elk. So, basically, I got back out, got to another spot, and we found elk, but it was too late, right? It was the
Yeah.
last day we couldn't get it done. And like from that, I learned like I should have been staying on top of that canyon, being more mobile, driving, hiking in, glassing, calling, and then finding them, then going down versus going down into one spot where you're just stuck there. Um, yeah, this unit, there are some spots where I can get 3 or 4 miles back in there and be away from roads. There's some stuff. There's some private land borders. I want to talk about that a little bit too. I want to go back to the nighttime calling because Clint said the same thing last week. Um, he said, he says 2 in the morning. He says him and Brian Barney like 2 in the morning will call coyotes or call elk and then kind of coyote them. And then when you say nighttime, are you doing it like 2 in the morning nighttime, or are you doing it like it gets dark at 9 o'clock, and then you go and do it? What does that look like for you?
It's typically not long after dark. So I would
Okay.
say 9 to 11 o'clock at night. And there's a couple reasons. First, uh, elk are on the move, and typically right before dark is when they move. By the time it gets dark, they're typically in their feeding areas where they're going to spend the night, feeding, bedded down, getting water, and then the next day they're going to get up and move to their daytime bedding areas. So by dark at night, and this is again generally speaking, a lot of times elk will move considerably at night, and especially that early part of the season, those bigger bulls will start roaming, looking for the cows, looking to establish their harems. So for me, though, a couple nights of 2 in the morning trying to locate elk, and you don't have a lot of energy during the day. So
Yeah.
I like to make sure I'm getting, good sleep. And that allows me to stay out during the day, which we can get into, the midday hunting, which I think in Colorado, there's some good opportunity there that we can get into. But for locating elk, and it goes back to what you said about when you hunted Oregon, picking a ridge, dropping down into a basin, coming back up. If that's your method for locating elk, that's not a real effective method, especially in areas where elk move and where there's pressure. And we deal with predators in Idaho, and predators change the landscape on an hourly basis, on a daily basis. And if you put all your eggs in that basket of, hey, I'm going to drop down into this basin because there were elk there last week, you might get there and find nothing but tracks from last week, and not an elk to be seen or heard in that area because of wolves and things. So two-legged pressure is very similar. Elk realize where there's danger, they realize where there's activity that they don't like, and they're going to keep on the move until they find a place where they're safe. They might only be there for 2 days where they feel safe, and then somebody comes and bumps them and they go to their next sanctuary spot. So elk are mobile. It's important for us to be mobile. If it's an area where you can glassing at first light and last light can be effective to be able to spot the elk, where they feeding out of, where they go into, kind of get a pattern established for where to find them the next morning. But calling, for me, I just like calling. I like the
Mhm.
interaction. I think I wouldn't say it's easier, but I think it's more efficient to be able to use calls to locate, especially if you're wanting to use calls to bring the elk in. Because if you get a call or a bull to respond to your location bugle, there's a chance he's going to respond when you move in and set up and try to call him in. If you've got an elk over there that you glass up and you call to him 5 or 6 times and he doesn't even lift his head and respond to you, there's a good chance that when you get in close, he's going to be a tough one to get to respond to calls. So at the end of the day, if I want to call an elk in, I feel that if I can find an elk using calls, that elk's going to be more subject or more likely to respond to those calls in that situation.
Okay, so you said don't pigeonhole myself. I'm gonna call 9 to 11 o'clock. Now, when you say run and gun, now should I have camp on my back? Because now I'm kind of like I don't want to backpack into a spot and pigeonhole myself. I kind of want to be mobile, so just maybe have camp, have my tarp on my back, have sleeping pad, bag, minimal 2 days worth of food, and then go out. So I find an elk 9 o'clock at night. Okay, there's some elk in this area. Hiking after them. Have camp just in case I need to stay in there.
I typically don't in a situation like what you're describing with, if you can get 3, 4 miles from a road into a pocket, you
Hmm.
can easily day hunt that. 3 miles
Okay.
in, 3 miles out. That's easy. The problem you run into, especially in an area like that where there are pockets and elk are easily, bumped from one pocket into another one. When you go in and camp in that small of a pocket, it can be hard to get away from the elk, which you want to do when you camp. You don't want to
Okay.
camp on a ridge where the thermals are going down at night right into the basin you want to hunt. And it's more comfortable to camp from the truck. I stay mobile for sure, and I keep my camp in the truck. I don't set up a base camp and just drive back to it. I want to make sure that if I have to drive 30 miles one night to find an elk to bugle, I put my camp out right there next to the truck. The next morning I wake up, get the thermals right, and move in on that elk or into that basin where the elk is. So, being mobile doesn't mean putting camp on your back necessarily, and being mobile in the backcountry. I'm talking being mobile to move around a lot to find elk. Then once you find them, in a situation like you're describing, I'm probably just going to camp from the truck and move in 2 miles, 3 miles, hunt those elk, stay there for the day, hunt them that evening. If they're not there, if they're not conducive to calling, I'm going to come back out and spend that night looking for more elk in another location.
And you're looking for them to be called. So you're not like, let's say I find these elk, I know they're in this area. You're not making a blind and sitting over a wallow. Not your style.
And again, that comes back to you have to adapt. And if you're after 3 or 4 days realizing these elk just aren't calling, I'm spotting elk, I'm seeing elk from a mile away, they're feeding out on this open hillside, they're going back into this thick stuff and bedding. I've been in there, I know they're there, but they just aren't talking. Then you have to adapt to that and say, okay, it's hot, it's early season, the younger bulls are with the cows. The bigger bulls still haven't come in and gotten with the cows. How am I going to be effective? Is it a matter of do they feed out in the exact same place the last 3 mornings? Then you can go and
Mhm.
ambush them, get the wind right, set up below a trail, and wait for them to come out and be there, an hour before daylight, so that you're there, things are settled down, you can take advantage of when they come through that area. If you're hiking around and you know the elk are in there and you find a wallow, and that wallow is active, and there's been bulls in there wallowing in the mud or in the water, you can go and set up a blind and sit there on that. But it again comes down to what's going to be most effective to be able to capitalize on the situation you're given. Early season like that, water can be really effective. It's usually going to be pretty warm still, so elk are going to be watering at least once, maybe even twice during the day. And if you have a good water source there where you've seen them, or where you maybe hang a trail camera and see elk are coming in every evening at 6 o'clock, then you can kind of pattern them that way. I don't completely ever go away from calling. I'm still going to try to locate elk with calls at night, just to find one that's responsive, and then be able to go and hunt that one. And the other thing is, I'll move into the edge of a bedding area in the middle of the day and get the thermals good and set up and just do some soft calling, just some herd calling, throwing out some cow calls and trying to get a young bull to maybe come in, or a more mature bull that says, you know what, today's the day when I'm going to start looking for cows and rounding up cows. And that happens in that first part of September. So the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th of September can be a really good time to find a bull that's out roaming looking for cows, that's going to be a little bit more responsive, a little more willing to talk to locate the cows, a little more willing to talk to establish dominance in an area. And before all that pressure comes in, it can be effective to use calls for sure.
Do you think I should wait until the 5th to go over there?
Is it going to waiting to the 5th? Is that going to give you some more days on the tail end of your hunt?
I can do it many days I want. I'm going to Wyoming on the 24th to hunt antelope. So I kind of liked going the first part of the month so I can get back for at least a week to see my kids and my
Yeah,
wife. So, but
absolutely.
you know how it goes. I'm going to be
Yeah.
gone like
So,
3 weeks a month hunting, so I need to give wife something. I have 5 kids.
yep. So if season opens on the 2nd and you effectively have until the 17th to hunt,
Hmm.
uh, I would say be there on opening day.
Okay.
And it's going to change the season, the tactics, they're going to change from opening day to what you're doing on the 17th. Is there muzzleloader season in that unit?
I'm not sure. I have to look and see. I think
You
it'd be
might
the end of the month.
you might check on that, because it's usually about the third week of season. So anytime from
Mhm.
like the 12th through the 16th, there's usually a muzzleloader season that'll open up, and that could really impact your hunt. Now you have people out there middle of the season during the rut with calls shooting off muzzleloaders, and so that's going to change the patterns of the elk really quickly. So definitely check on that. Maybe check and see how many muzzleloader hunters are in there each season, and that'll give you an idea of what to expect during that week. That would also, determine if and I should know, and I don't know just because I'm not going to Colorado this year and haven't looked closely at the season dates. But if the muzzleloader season runs the 13th through the 19th, that's going to really affect. I wouldn't want to wait until the 5th or 6th and only have 5 or 6 days
Mhm.
before muzzleloader hunters show up. I'd want to be there on the 2nd. If the muzzleloader season opens on the 17th and that's when you're planning on leaving anyway, it might not hurt to wait till the 5th. A couple things that I would consider: Labor Day weekend is always going to be busy in the woods. There's on
Mhm.
public land, there's going to be campers, there's going to be hikers, there's going to be mountain bikers, there's going to be a lot of people out enjoying a 3-day weekend, which will impact the habits and the activities of the elk, maybe for a good way, maybe for a negative way, but just something I would keep in mind, that there's going to be more activity out there. So I wouldn't, I would probably go and look for pockets of elk a little bit farther away from the road, and then maybe come back and do some night bugling after Labor Day weekend when roads settle down a little bit. Uh, but hunting early is, even if you show up on the 2nd and you just say, I'm going to spend the first 3 days until Labor Day weekend's over, whenever it hits, I'm going to do that and just learn the country. I'm going to try to find pockets of elk. I'm not going to go in and disrupt them yet. I'm going to try to pattern them. I'm going to see if they're coming out in the same places. I'm going to listen for bugles and get an idea, and then really hit it hard after that weekend traffic clears out.
And you think that they will be bugling at night, even like the first week of September?
They definitely can. So I hunted Colorado in 2012, I believe. So 10, 12 years ago on public land, and we hunted early. It opened, I want to say August 27th, 28th back then, somewhere in there. And we had bulls bugling on the first day. In fact,
Nice.
some of our best bugling was the first 2 or 3 days of the season. And then Labor Day weekend hit, a lot of traffic came in, and the elk just quit talking for a few days. Just, they got pressured. They weren't really starting to rut yet. They weren't gathering cows a lot yet. So they didn't have a reason to keep talking. And that pressure from all the people in there kind of shut them down vocally. So there's absolutely opportunity that elk will be bugling on opening day.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So I'm getting excited. I really am. So, all right. So now we kind of got that. Should we talk about? I want to talk about the midday hunting, but I kind of want to talk about something else first. How much am I focusing on? Like, there's a big piece of private property in there in this unit. So I would assume that that big ranch is probably going to have some bulls on it. How much should I be skirting that property? Is that a good strategy?
Yeah, so not knowing the exact layout, but if there's a big section of private land in the middle of the unit and it's got some low country, some fields, some meadows, some water in it,
Mhm.
that's going to hold elk, and that's going to hold elk throughout the summer. And what it's primarily going to hold is the herds of cows and calves. And so bulls are typically going to move up the mountain for the summer. They're going to get up to higher elevation. They're going to spend the summer up there. Once the rut kicks in and starts kicking in, then they're going to start moving down looking for the cows. So cows probably, I mean, there'll be cows on the public land away from that ranch for sure, but that ranch is probably going to hold a good number, a good population of elk, primarily cows and calves during the summer. So those bulls will be up probably on the ridges that lead down onto the private until that 5th to 10th of September, when they'll start moving down closer to it, start getting excited about establishing their harems, establishing dominance, and going in to breed the cows during the rut. So I absolutely, especially early, I would spend time on the ridges on the public land that run down into that private, looking for those lone bulls that haven't moved down yet. They might be herd bulls, but they haven't moved down with the herds yet. There's going to be young bulls up there that are like, hey, the bulls are still up here, the cows are down there. I don't know what to do. I'm going to go down and check out the cows, but then I'm going to come back and bed up here. So there will absolutely be elk moving across that border. And early, like you say, once the pressure really hits after a week or two, those elk, the rut's going to be on. The bulls are going to be down on the private with the cows. They're going to be pressured, so they're going to be finding sanctuary down there on that private. So it can be more difficult, but definitely early on, I would be skirting the edge of that and looking for the elk that are still up on the public.
As a general rule, if you're hunting the edge of public with a bow, how far off the edge of public are you staying? Because that's like, you know what I mean? Like, you don't want to be 100 yards because I feel like elk can move a lot. Like, I've shot them with rifles and they can still go a long ways with some bullets in them. good shots.
Absolutely. Yeah, so you have to keep that in mind that, is it straight downhill? Are they coming up out of the private? And if so, if they're coming up out of the private on a ridge and you're set up 60 yards onto the public and you shoot that elk, he's probably going to turn around and run straight back from where he came. And there's a good chance he's going to make it 60 yards or more, even with the best shot. So you have to keep that in mind. But again, that fence line is a boundary, and the elk know that, and they know that for whatever reason, every time I come below this fence line, pressure lightens up, and every time I go above it, seems like I'm getting chased from draw to draw. So they learn that that fence line is a buffer of activity, and if they're coming up above it, you just got to figure out how far they're going and try to establish. Okay, there's a bedding area, a bench up here, and it's 600 yards above the private. Am I trying to intercept them halfway in between? Am I waiting for the thermals to change and I want to be above it and I have plenty of a buffer there? But the last thing you want to do, and I believe in Colorado, uh, I don't think that a landowner has to allow you onto the private to recover an animal. And again, every state's different. Some states allow you to, go in and recover an animal on private land. Most of them don't. And so depending on that landowner, they might say, I don't want people hunting even close to my land, so I'm not going to give them permission to recover an elk. And then that's something that you just don't want to get into, shooting an elk and having it run 250 yards and fall over dead, and you can see it laying 100 yards inside the private and not be able to get to it. So you definitely have to keep that in mind. I would say in a typical situation, I am probably going to want to stay at least 300 yards, probably closer to, that quarter mile to half mile range away from that fence line.
All right, so 4 to 800 yards range. Um, okay, so now I understand that like elk prime time, 6 a.m., 9 a.m., 10 a.m., right around there. You talk about midday. I never go back to camp. Like I will. I'm a big like I love Coues deer. I will glass Coues deer all day long. I kill a lot of my deer in the middle of the day. I'll spend 10 hours in the glass. No joke,
Yep.
right? I freaking make it have an optics company, right? Or a tripod company is what I do. I love glassing. Same thing. So what do I do? Like I'm not gonna go back to camp and make breakfast. What am I doing in the middle of the day? How am I
So,
increasing my odds?
yeah. So, I mean, you talk about the first couple hours of daylight, the last couple hours of daylight during the day, those are prime time. And the reason why is the elk are active. They're up moving, they're feeding, they're visible. You're able to sit on a hillside and watch across the canyon, and your chances of seeing an elk move out onto an open hillside go up tremendously. The elk are on the move, so they're more vocal. When they're on the move, they're using their vocalizations just to keep in touch with each other. A herd bull that's with a group of cows, a lot of times, is going to keep his cows rounded up using a bugle. And it might be a soft bugle. He might not be bugling every 30 seconds, especially in a public land heavy hunted area like that in Colorado. But they're going to use vocalization. You're going to hear bugles. You're going to hear cow talking. And when people say, calls aren't effective, they're still hearing a few bugles. They're still hearing cow calls, but when they blow a cow call or they blow a bugle, the elk clam up and they go quiet. And that's just because they've been pressured so much. So you can still use the elk's vocalizations to your advantage to pinpoint them and locate them. So that's helpful during that early morning, late evening time frame. But then the elk go and bed down, and they typically don't move much, if at all, during the day. And so that's why everybody goes back to camp. They aren't seeing elk, they aren't hearing elk bugling, elk aren't on the move, they're bedded down. So a lot of hunters go back and they spend the day in camp doing the same thing the elk are doing, just hunkering down, resting, and then they go back out for the next wave of activity, which comes in the evening. But during the middle of the day, every one of the elk that were out there that morning are still on the landscape, and they are
Mhm.
susceptible to different tactics, whether that is, coming into water. If it's hot, a bull's going to probably be worked up. He's probably going to go bed down with the cows. Once the cows settle down, there's no action going on. He might get up and go into a water hole and wallow or get a drink. So knowing that can be helpful. The thing that I love about midday is calling can be really effective. And especially if you know where the elk are bedding, if you know they're going into this timber patch on this bench, I know they're in there, but from across the canyon here, I don't hear them. I don't see them all day long, but I know they're in there because they come back out in the evening and then they go back in on the same trail. You get the thermals good, you slip in really quietly and just sit and listen. And then you move in another 100 yards and you sit and listen and maybe throw out a couple cow calls every once in a while. Not enough to be aggressive, not enough to make them think, hey, there's something there trying to catch my attention with calls. They're getting pretty aggressive. I'm getting nervous because there's been a lot of activity in here. They get up and move out. But just a couple cow calls, and then you just sit there quiet, listen for branches breaking. And a lot of times a bull will get up and slip in just to see, why are there a couple cows bedded up here? They should be down bedded on the bench with us. And the other thing is a lot of times after a couple cow calls, 30, 40 minutes, those cows don't end up down on the bench with that bull. He's probably going to bugle and say, hey, we're down here. You guys come down here. And when that happens, you can move in, you can challenge him. There's a lot of different plays you can make, but those elk aren't moving. If you have an idea of where they're bedding, you can slip in and, spot and stalk. You can slip in and do some soft calling. You can slip into a nearby water hole and try to ambush them that way. There's just a lot of opportunity to hunt during the middle of the day. For me personally, I like the calling, getting in close, getting them to respond, challenging the bull and getting him to come in. Again, in a heavily hunted area like Colorado, that aggressive challenge bugle sequence might not be as effective later in the season. But that time frame you're talking about, when they haven't been pressured and they haven't become a little bit wary to calling can be really effective. And it might not be a 30 bugles back and forth type of a setup. It might be a cow call, the bull answers you, you scream a challenge at him and then sit there quietly and let that sit in his mind for a while. He's going to get maybe a little curious and come in looking for you. So just a lot of opportunity during the middle of the day that I would definitely not be going back to camp and wasting those hours.
So I know people hate comparing turkey calling to elk, right? But like one thing I've learned with turkeys is like, "Tuk, tuk, 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 tuk," and then wait 15 minutes. And it seems like you kind of have that same strategy. Like you're not out there just like bugling your head off. You're giving it some time. Like you're being patient. Like I feel like a lot of stuff I see is just, run and gun, charging. You can be loud because elk are loud. Get in there, be aggressive. And it seems like you're aggressive when you have to, but you're also really patient up until that point. Correct?
Absolutely. And just, I really like to put myself in the mindset of the elk. When you're hunting an elk where there's a lot of bugling action, there's cows, there's herd bulls everywhere, you start to realize, okay, there's there's a lot of bulls. There's a lot of competition. These bulls are getting they're facing competition every day. Somebody's trying to come in and steal their cows. So you can kind of play into the actual situation that's going on there. When you look at Colorado public land over the counter with potentially a lot of pressure in there, what are the elk doing? They still have to rut. They still have to establish dominance. They still have to attract cows. They still have to go out and feed where there's feed. They still have to go and bed down on a north face where they're going to feel safe. They just aren't going to be as aggressive or as vocal when they're doing it. So realizing an elk is thinking a lot more about staying alive right now than he is about breeding, you've got to play into that. You don't want to go in there aggressive and making all sorts of noise because that's going to push that elk. That's going to scare that elk. But that elk is still interested in cows. He's still interested in cow calls. He's still expecting that there might be a bull with cows that he hears. So it's not unusual to hear a bugle, but he's going to be a lot more wary. So yeah, I mean, I'm quiet. I'll put the calls away if I have to. I'll sit water if I have to. I'll let out a couple of cow calls and sit patiently listening for a branch to break for 30 minutes if I have to. My ideal situation is bulls bugling everywhere and I can just run from one bugle to the next and call in multiple bulls a day. But the reality is that's very rare. And it's, those opportunities are few and far between.
And it also seems like you're doing, when you say run and gun, a lot of your run and gunning is done at after hours. So once I find these elk, you're kind of committing that day to that 3 miles in. Like you're not coming back out and moving middle of the day, or is it like sometimes you move in the middle of the day?
Yeah, sometimes I will. If we get in there
Okay.
and realize, that bull is just he's got cows, he's seen other hunters the last 3 days. He is not going to come in. He's not going to make a mistake. I'll go find a different herd of elk, and that might be at 10 in the morning. I might sit there all day during the middle of the day, and when I realize the midday thing isn't working and they're not coming out until right at dark, I might get up at 4 in the afternoon or 5 in the evening and hike back out to the truck and go make a quick run down another ridge trying to locate elk or look for signs. So when I say run and gun, there's a couple things. One, you want to stay mobile, and so you can run the roads in a vehicle and run out on a ridge and bugle and try to get a response. Go back. If you're solely looking for a response, you've got to stay mobile and you've got to try a lot of different areas. Primarily, though, when I say run and gun, it is finding an area that I want to hike into and covering every square inch of that area. So I'm going from ridge to ridge. I'm bugling. I'm looking for sign. I'm setting up and calling if there's something there. If it doesn't work out, I'm getting up and moving until I find the next opportunity. So, it's really going from one opportunity to the next and not getting hung up with, hey, I found a group of elk. I'm going to spend the next 8 days hunting this group of elk, when there's just not an efficient play uh, that you're able to make to be able to capitalize on what those elk are doing.
So cast a broad net.
Cast a
Cast a broad.
really broad net and
Yep.
realize that you've got a big body of land there, and that one elk that you're looking for might be in one little hidden pocket right back here, and your goal is to uncover that pocket and find that elk.
All right. Now let's go to the calling side of it because you are world champion caller. Yes, you've done a couple of those.
I have, yeah.
So I have just started calling a few months ago, and I'm calling in San Diego in my office because my wife does not want me calling in the house. In fact, I woke up my son bugling yesterday, my 4-year-old.
Nice.
Um,
So you're sleeping in the garage now.
yeah, yeah. So, dude, he sleeps in our bed, man. Our 4-year-old, we adopted our 4-year-old. We got him at 2 days old, and this is totally off topic, but we thought we were going to lose him for like three. It took us 3 years to get him adopted. So my wife, like, he was just in our bed with us, right? Well, the problem is, well, we ended up adopting, which is not a problem. It's a blessing. We're so blessed by God to have our son. But now he's just in our bed. He's almost 5, and he just like sleeps in our bed. Like we put him in his bed, and he wakes up and comes in our bed. And I'm just like, oh my gosh. In fact, this is totally off topic again. I have a little poodle will jump in bed with us too, a little tiny one, at the feet of our bed. Well, Dylan, my 4-year-old, somehow got to the bottom of our bed like sideways. And I almost gave him, like, the little dog boot you give your dog,
Yeah.
kick him off the bed. I almost gave Dylan the dog boot and kicked him off the bed the other night. And thank God I felt over to make sure it was him, because I almost kicked my 4-year-old off of our, queen bed, 3 feet to the ground.
So that's one way to get him to quit coming into bed with you, but
Oh man, it's impossible. He's stuck with us. I'm hoping we can get him out of there by the time he's a teenager. Um, he's getting there. He'll get there. All right. So calling, um, I'm not going to be as good as Corey Jacobson at calling. That's just even if I try every day, you're probably just naturally better than me at doing this. Um, how good do I need to be to do these location bugles at night? I mean, are they going to call back to my bugle, or are they going to hear my bugle and be like, "That's not an elk"?
and that's a great question, because a lot of people don't like to call because they aren't confident in the sounds they make. And so they just think, calling's not going to work. The great news is, to be able to locate elk and even to call elk in, you don't have to be a great caller. In fact, you
Okay.
want to you want to simplify it. You want to just really practice a couple simple sounds that I really feel anyone can master and make plenty well enough to use to locate and call in elk, even in a place like Colorado. But what a lot of times happens is people start thinking, I've got to learn how to make 10 different bugles and I've got to
Mhm.
sound different on each one. And really, I think simplicity is better in an area like that. Just a simple cow call for a location bugle. We're talking 2, maybe 3 notes, just going up and hitting that high note and then coming back
Mhm.
down with something simple. You don't need to chuckle. You don't need to do any of that.
Okay.
With that being said, the more realistic that you can sound, the better your chances are going to be in an area where elk are call shy, because they're going to hear a lot of different sounds, and they're going to hear a lot of people making some pretty bad sounds. And typically, and I don't want to be too generalized here, but someone who doesn't spend a lot of time practicing with calls isn't going to sound as good. And that same person probably isn't going to have as much of an understanding of things like thermals and how elk use their senses to stay alive. And so a lot of times they're going to end up making a bad call from a place where an elk's also going to smell them. So the elk's going to start correlating danger with those bad sounding calls, which is why they become call shy. They want to stay alive. And every time they hear a bad call, they think of danger. And that doesn't mean when somebody goes in and they sound just like an elk, that elk's going to immediately respond and say, okay, it's not danger. They're always going to have that in the back of their mind. But the better you can sound with the sounds that you make, the
Mhm.
less likely an elk is going to be to just get up and leave without responding. He might not come into it, but he's at least going to respond and be like, that sounded pretty good. I don't get that feeling of danger that I get when somebody sounds absolutely horrible that I've heard over and over again while I've smelled humans.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think I've got the whole, like that down pretty good. Like, when
Yep.
I start trying to do some other stuff, it's not as good. I'm working on it.
And
Um,
there's not other stuff you need to do. I mean, that's the
okay.
location bugle. What you did right there, going up and hitting the high note, coming back down the scale, that's location
Mhm.
bugle. When you try to get too fancy and throw in a couple chuckles at the end, that for me, I can tell 99% of the time if a bugle is a human or an elk when they chuckle. And the reason why isn't because elk sound so phenomenal when they chuckle. It's just most hunters really struggle to make a realistic sounding chuckle. And if a hunter, gets
Okay.
excited and wants to throw in a chuckle, typically it gives him away. And if I can tell, that somebody sounds unauthentic, that it's not an elk, elk probably can become kind of tuned to that as well.
Gotcha. All right. So that makes me feel a little better about myself. And then just your typical cow calls, your whole yeah, like
Yep.
that's all I need.
That's all you need.
And
Yep.
how many of these little meows am I putting out when I'm getting 100 yards from them and making that like to try and locate them in the middle of the day?
So if you're 100 yards from them, you only need one. But if
Okay.
if
Yeah.
you're up above them and you don't know exactly where they are and you're just trying to locate them, I'll typically cow call first. I'll do probably two, maybe three cow calls just through my mouth, no tube or anything. And then I'll sit there for a while. And if nothing answers, nothing comes in, then I might give two or three cow calls through my tube, which is going to broadcast it and make it a lot louder. So if the elk are a little farther away, something farther away might be able to hear that. From there, though, I don't keep blowing through the tube. I just do that, basically cast that broader net to get the net out there a little farther. If nothing responds to that, I start calling more on the micro level, a little bit closer, more soft, subtle cow calls. But again, I'm just doing two or three at a time, and then I'll wait several minutes, and then I'll do two or three more, and just sit there and listen. And the thing when you're hunting like that, where you're almost just still hunting, but giving them an incentive to come in to you quietly, you want to make sure your setup is good. You want to make sure that you've got shooting lanes that, because an elk is all of a sudden just going to show up 30 yards away and you don't know how he got there. You don't know how he made it without alerting you, making any noise, but all of a sudden there's a big animal standing 30 yards away looking either at you or for you. And so you want to make sure when you set up and start calling, even if you don't set up, if you're going to call, that elk might be there in 20 seconds. It might be 100 yards just out of view. You let out one cow call and all of a sudden it turns and comes walking right at you. And if you're standing out in the middle of something, or if you're standing in the middle of a pile of brush and you don't have any shooting lanes, you just blew an opportunity. So anytime I call, I like to remind myself, make sure you're set up and ready, and make sure that if you're here for 30 minutes, you don't know when that bull's going to show up, so that you're ready when every time you call.
Gotcha. All right. And when you say like not in the middle of the open, so like have a tree against your back or a bush against your back, something that'll break you up a little bit.
Yep. Yeah. So when I set up, the last thing you want to do is set up behind something, behind an obstacle, behind a tree, behind a rock, behind a brush, some kind of brush, or, whatever you've got. You just don't want to set up behind stuff because you're placing an obstacle directly in most of your shooting lanes. So you want to set up in front of that stuff, but you also want to use what's behind you to break up your outline. And also be aware that when an elk comes into view, you're set up in front of stuff now. So you're kind of exposed. So you really have to limit your movement and then time your movement for when the elk can't see you. So if he's coming across a wide open meadow and you're set up on the edge of that meadow, it's going to be really hard to get drawn. You're going to need him to turn his head away from you to be able to draw your bow back. Whereas if you're set up and he's coming through trees, when he comes behind a tree is a good time for you to move. When his eye, if you can't see his eyes, he can't see you. But if you can see his eyes, he's going to be able to pick up on every little movement. And he's probably going to be looking for that movement.
Gotcha. That kind of brings me to the next point that I want to talk about, which is thermals. Because you said I have a bush behind you. The reason why I don't even worry about what's behind me is so the wind's in my face, correct?
Typically,
So,
yeah.
so, so I'm not having to worry about. I'm worried about what's kind of in front of me. That's why he's going to show up in front of me. Hopefully, let's talk about thermals. You said thermals probably 5 times in this last 50 minutes. So sounds like they're important. Let's talk about thermals.
Thermals are everything. And I really, I would leave, and I say this somewhat jokingly, but also to demonstrate how serious I am about thermals. I would leave if I had to choose an elk call and a wind detector, a little bottle with the powder in it.
Hmm.
I would choose the wind detector. And I say that just to illustrate it's the number one most important thing. It doesn't matter
Yes.
how good your calls sound. It doesn't matter how responsive an elk is. If you aren't paying attention to the wind, the elk is. And he's going to probably come in downwind and smell you before he comes in to allow you to get a shot. So thermals, wind, a lot of times we call it wind, but in the mountains, you typically aren't dealing with wind necessarily. It's that diurnal thermals, which changes twice a day. So it's just the contrast of the ground heat and the air heat. And as the air warms up, it starts moving up. And as it cools down, it starts dropping. So the thermals, the breeze is moving along the terrain when it's cool out. It's moving down. When it warms up, it's moving up. And so the elk utilize that knowledge to base their patterns and their movements. So when the thermals are moving down the mountain, the elk are typically moving up the mountain to their bedding area. And when the thermals are moving up the mountain, the elk are typically up higher on the mountain in a bedding area where they can smell any danger from down below them. So as I'm moving in on elk, as I'm setting up on elk, as I'm strategizing for how to get across the canyon and get above a bedding area where I saw elk move into, the first thing I always think about is what are the thermals doing right now? What are they doing right here? What are they doing where the elk are? And what are they going to be doing in 15 minutes? What are they going to be doing in 4 hours? And really kind of develop a plan and a strategy based on the thermals.
Okay, so hearing that, I think people might hear like, well, how am I supposed to stalk these elk then? Right? So, because you're saying, so if wind's moving down in the mornings, you want to be downwind of those elk. So let's say I'm calling from above the night before I find these elk. Do I need to get down the bottom of that canyon and be hunting back up in the morning when it's? So do I need to get down there like 4 a.m., hike down and 2 miles into that canyon early, knowing what the thermals are going to do? Because I don't want to try. I don't want to start hiking down at sunrise because then my wind's going to go right down on these elk. Correct?
Absolutely. Yep. And that's, Donnie, my hunting partner, Donnie, we always tell the story. The first time I met Donnie was at work, and my area that I typically elk hunted was on fire. And I mentioned to him, yeah, I don't know where I'm going to go. The area I'm used to hunting is closed off right now because of a fire. And he said, well, there's an area I've hunted forever. There's elk in there. I've never killed one, but there's always elk in there. I think he'd hunted that area for 14 years or 17 years and never killed an elk with his bow in there. And the first morning I went in there, I shot an elk. And he couldn't believe it. He's like, all right, you got to take me in there. So I don't remember if it was, that same season or maybe the next season, but the first time we hunted together, we went into his area where I had killed an elk previously. And we got up on the ridge that I had hiked out to where I had located my elk. We let out a bugle, and down in the bottom of this basin, a bull bugles. And I'm like, all right, we're good. And Donnie just takes off and starts hiking straight down. I'm like, whoa, 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 where are you going? And he's like, didn't he just bugle down here? I'm like, yeah, but the thermals are going straight down there. And I puff my little powder, and he's looking at it going, what's that have to do with anything? And I said, we've got to completely go around this basin, get on the other side of the basin and slip in underneath him. If we drop straight off the ridge right here, we go another 100 yards, our scent's going to make it down to where that elk is, and he's going to quit bugling. And he's like, huh, that might be why they always quit bugling when I try to hunt them in here. So we went around and, we've hunted together since then, but we always talk about, we so many times hunters get in there and they're so mesmerized by the calling. They're so excited that they've
Mhm.
located elk and found elk that they forget about the most important thing. And that is the thing that keeps the elk alive every minute of every day. And that's their nose. And they use the thermals to, to stay alive. I mean, they really, everything they do is based on the thermals. So when you're talking about elk bugling, you locate them from up on the ridge. They're down in the bottom. The next morning, you can't just get on that same ridge and drop straight down to them. You've got to get back a ridge or two and drop down and get on their level and then come across to them so that your thermals are going down below where they're at. I don't necessarily like to get all the way below them if the thermals are going down, or all the way above them if the thermals are going up. I like to get on their level and kind of move across to them. And so I'm kind of going perpendicular to the direction the thermals are moving.
So you might be able to drop in 2 canyons over or a canyon over and then come down and then cross over that ridge at their level, is what you're
Absolutely.
saying. I got
Yep.
you. Okay. Okay, cool. Uh, on the powder stuff, this is off topic again. My favorite, powder is the smoke in the bottle. Have you used smoke in the bottle?
That's what I use. Yep.
That's my favorite one because like the other ones are almost like a talcum powder, like baby powder. The smoke in the bottle is it costs like 7 or 8 bucks, but it's so worth it versus like the $2 of baby powder. Like it's
Yep.
smoke in the bottle is the best one. So if you're listening to this, there's your pro tip for the day. Buy smoke in the bottle. My archery shop sells it. I buy it from them. Support your local archery shop too. That's another tip. All right. I'm gonna call this podcast Elk Hunting for Dummies because it's so good. And I feel like it's gonna help me so much. Uh we always end with a story. I want you to do a story, but before we get to that, let's talk arrow selection and that because that's controversial right now. People are going really heavy. People are going really light. Like I went to a 4 millimeter arrow and I'm like 465. How much does it matter? And then obviously mechanicals versus fixed. Let's just talk about arrow selection real quick because I feel like rifles and arrow selection is what's the sexy part of all this stuff. People like it. Let's
For
talk about it.
sure. So you said it's a controversial topic right now. It was controversial in the 1980s. I mean, it's been as long as archery has been around. There's been the argument of speed versus weight, and
Mhm.
at the end of the day, I think there's a happy balance in there. You don't want to shoot an arrow that's too light because it's not gonna have any momentum. Soon as it hits, all that energy is transferred and it has nothing to keep that arrow moving into the target, which in this case is a really strong animal with big bones. So you don't want anything too light. On the flip side, the heavier your arrow is, the bigger your pin gap is. So the less accurate you're going to be with your bow. The smaller margin of error you're going to have, when you go to a too heavy of an arrow, you're going to have a lot of momentum, a lot of impact power. When that hits, you're going to have a lot of energy that keeps moving and pulls that broadhead and that arrow into the animal, deeper into the target, and might be able to break through some bones and overcome some of those obstacles there. But what you gain in that, you lose in accuracy. And I'm not saying, somebody who's an incredible shot can get away with a heavier arrow and not give up as much on that accuracy. But I really think there's a good middle of the road approach there. You want an arrow that is going to be able to transfer energy, that's going to be able to continue to push into that target without losing all of its energy because it's too light. But you also want to be able to maintain some speed so that you can be accurate and have a little bit of forgiveness if you misjudge a target by 3 yards. And for me personally, I shoot, I think my arrows are about 465, 470 grains. I shoot a 100 grain broadhead with a 40 grain, basically insert weight on the front of the arrow. I could shoot a heavier broadhead, but I've always shot 100 grain. That's what I've got. And so rather than changing that, I just put some weight on the
Right
insert.
behind it.
Yeah. So that gets me a good, uh, FOC, front of center, where the balance point is. That FOC is important. It allows your arrow to stabilize in flight. It also puts weight up front, which is going to help with transfer, getting that momentum going forward into the target. So there's some benefits there. But at the end of the day, I speed used to be a huge thing. Everybody wanted to be shooting super fast bows. So the way they accomplished that was they shot lighter arrows. And as long as you're hitting in the right place, you're typically going to be okay. The problem is there's a lot of unknown and a lot of factors that come into play, and you might hit a rib, you might hit a shoulder blade, you might, all these different things where an arrow getting deep inside the body cavity of that elk is going to be beneficial. So then people started going on the extreme other side of it and shooting 700 grain arrows, and there are these
Mhm.
great big logs that are coming out, and if they shoot at 30 yards but they misjudge it by 3 yards, they hit 6 inches low now instead of an inch low. And so I like to basically find a good middle ground. But the most important thing is make sure your arrows are tuned. Make sure your arrows are flying good. Make sure that you're shooting the right spine arrow. Be proficient with your weapon, no matter what you shoot, whether it's speed or weight or somewhere in the middle. Shoot your bow a lot so that you're comfortable with it, and also determine where your effective range is. We have the Total Archery Challenge coming up, and they'll put targets out there at 100 yards. You'll never find me shooting at a live
No.
animal at 100 yards.
Very
But
humbling, very quickly.
but when I start at 20 yards and I start moving back, I can tell where I start getting uncomfortable, where I
Mhm.
start losing confidence. And the more that I shoot at 100 yards, the more confidence I have at 50 yards. If I just shoot at 20 yards all year long and then I go back to a 60-yard shot, it's going to feel like a long shot, and I'm not going to have a
Mhm.
lot of confidence there. But if I start and I spend most of my shooting practice at 80 yards or 100 yards, that's not so that I can shoot an animal at 80 or 100 yards. That's so when an animal comes in at 35 yards, it feels like a chip shot and I'm confident in it. So, I think that becoming proficient with your weapon and knowing where that cutoff is, where your effective range is, and then making a decision to stick to that, because you don't know how many times I've been with people that they shoot, but they just aren't grouping at 40 yards. So their effective range is probably 30. And then they get there and there's this big bull at 55 yards bugling. They've got a 50-yard pin and they think, you know what, I've got a 50-yard pin, I'm shooting. And they either miss it or they, worse off, they end up wounding it. And it's so important, especially for a new hunter, know your limitations. And before you even step in the woods, make up your mind you're not gonna fudge on that. You're not gonna, in the heat of the moment, make a bad decision.
Yeah, and, I don't know if you go by the same rule. I kind of find that if I can't keep a 4-inch group at 40 yards, I'm not proficient. So I wanna have a 4-inch group, a 5-inch group at 50, a 6-inch group at 60, and that's kinda how I judge myself, or even the paper plate thing as well, but I kinda tend to shoot for smaller dots. I shoot my bow a lot. I do a lot of the 3D shoots as well. That's why I say, like, man, people will say, "Oh, I'm gonna shoot 80 yards." Man, go shoot a 3D shoot at 80 yards, especially doing it cold.
Yeah.
It's just that's a far shot, so much stuff can go wrong.
Yep.
Um,
No, and that's the big thing. I always shoot my first arrow. I just shoot one arrow. I go out and I pick a place and I'm like, this is my hunting shot. This is my kill shot. And it really makes me focus. Whereas I go out and it's like, I'm going to shoot 100 arrows today. And my first 20 are going to be at 20 yards. I don't really have to I might not get warmed up for 20 shots. And
yeah,
I'm not focused like I am when I get one shot. And when you're out hunting, you'll carry your bow for 7 days and not even shoot once back at camp or in the woods. And all of a sudden, the moment of truth comes and you've got that one opportunity. You're cold, you get one shot, you have all those nerves going, you're tired, you're out of breath. And that one shot is the one that counts. So, like you said, I'll step up. My first shot will be, I'll tell myself, this is my opportunity, make it count. And that really gets me into focus. I'm really focused on that first shot, and it helps when I get out in the woods to make sure I'm capitalizing as best I can on that one opportunity I get.
it's great stuff. Fixed or mechanical?
I'm a fixed guy. And there's maybe a lineage, a history here of why that is. But when mechanicals first came out, they weren't reliable. They would not open sometimes. They would open early sometimes. There was just a lot of issues with them, and so we heard a lot of stories about people shooting at animals at 10 yards and the mechanical not opening, blowing right through and basically being like a field point, or the mechanical opening as soon as it comes off of the bow and it's flying, with the blades open and it hits the animal and doesn't penetrate, or it hits a bone, hits a rib bone, and basically penetrates about an inch and a half, and arrows just dangling out there. There were just a lot of issues, and my background is in mechanical engineering, and whenever you have a product, a system, a process, the more steps there are in that, the more things that can go wrong. And so with a mechanical broadhead, there are extra steps. There are extra things that have to happen. So there are just extra things that can go wrong. With that being said, they've come a long way and they've overcome a lot of those issues. But at the end of the day, if something can go wrong and if something does go wrong, I think a fixed head is going to give you more of a margin of error there. It's going to be able to overcome more of that than what a mechanical is. What a mechanical offers you, people always said, they fly just like my field points. And I've always said, if your bow is tuned and you're shooting the right arrows and the right broadhead combination, a fixed blade broadhead is going to fly just like your field points. And I've come to expect that from mine. I'd make sure my bow is tuned and I'm shooting the right arrows so that I can shoot total archery challenges all summer and then literally switch over and put broadheads on those exact same arrows and go out without changing a thing and keep shooting and be dialed in and confident there. So I, yes, you can get away with having a bow that maybe isn't as tuned as it should be by shooting mechanicals, but that's not the right approach in my mind. The other thing is I want to know that I've got that broadhead, that blade is open, it's hitting, and I don't have to worry about deflection or anything else. The thing that mechanicals get you is they punch a big hole. When things go
Mhm.
right, which, I'm not saying that they don't go right a lot of the times, but when they go right, they punch a big hole. I had never shot a mechanical at an animal until last year, and I shot an axis deer with a mechanical, and it did a phenomenal job. And I think I'm open-minded to shooting more animals with mechanicals, but a big animal like an elk, I think it would be really hard to get me to leave a fixed blade broadhead for a big animal like an elk.
So right now I'm really liking the Q80 Exodus.
Yep.
It flies really good. It's a over shaft blade, so it kind of comes over your shaft. So they fly really well. What fixed blade are you shooting?
I shoot the G5, the Striker X. I shot the Striker, the three blade forever, and when they came out with the X, I thought, well, four blades is more cutting surface than three. I'll try it, and they actually flew insanely well. Which I shoot three fletches on my arrow, so I wasn't sure if shooting a four blade broadhead if that would have any effect, and they fly incredibly well. So I've been shooting the Striker X for the last since they came out, like 4 years, 5 years, somewhere in there.
If it's broke, don't fix it.
That's right.
Yeah, I don't want to go into too far down that rabbit hole because I can start going crazy on arrows and all this stuff with you right now. Um, I do want to hear about your Axis hunt 'cause I'm going over there on Axis in a couple of months. Uh, we end with a story, so I'm sure you have a few stories. Just a campfire story, kind of, a hunt. As long as you want to make it, talk about that, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So, give us
Yeah.
a Corey Jacobson hunt story. It doesn't have to be your biggest bull. It could be bull with your grandpa. It doesn't matter. Just a story that's memorable to you and that you want the world to hear.
Yeah, man, there's so many, and it's, different times of the day, different times of the year, different ones kind of pop in your mind as being memorable.
Mhm.
Um, Gosh, my kids, I've been with my kids, sat right with them when they've all shot bulls with their bow. There's nothing like that as with Donnie when he shot his first elk with a bow. I think that before I jump into a story, and I'll maybe start the story with, I hunted elk with a tag in my pocket for 9 seasons before I killed my first elk. So, a lot of it was just a 12-year-old out there making 12-year-old mistakes, and I didn't learn as quickly as I should have. I was in elk country. I was blessed to grow up in elk country and be able to hunt after school. From the time I was 12. So I had a lot of experiences and I had a lot of opportunities to mess up. And through that, you kind of learn, okay, I can't make that mistake again. I can't make that mistake again. But we
Mhm.
do make those mistakes over and over. So, I'll share the story of the first elk I actually killed and how it came together. And I was in college. I'd taken off early and skipped classes on Friday and went home on Thursday night to hunt by myself. And, it's an area I'd hunted. It's heavily pressured, over the counter, public land. Uh, but it was during the week. I think it was about the third week of season. And I stepped out on a normal vantage point from my truck and let out a bugle, and two bulls answered down in the canyon. And I had probably an hour of daylight left before it was dark. And I thought, well, I'll go and give it a try, but at least I've got elk located for tomorrow. And that was kind of my mindset was, I'm not necessarily here to kill an elk tonight. I'll give it a shot, but really tomorrow is what I'm planning for. And so I'm moving down the ridge. The thermals are going down at that point. The elk are moving down into the low country down below. And so I'm hustling down an adjacent ridge, trying to keep the thermals good, thinking about that. And I pop over the ridge and let out a bugle, thinking the bulls are still going to be down below me, and I'd actually covered enough ground that a bull bugled straight to my left. So I'm now at his level. I'm on a adjacent ridge to him. And, it's kind of one of those things. I can still see everything there. I can't really remember what was going through my mind, but I thought I'm going to set up right here and try to call this elk in. Since then, I've learned, a lot of times we have to move in on the elk and get closer to him before we set up. But at that point, the elk's probably 400 yards away, across the ridge from me, across on an adjacent ridge. And I set up right there and just started calling to him. And for whatever reason, that bull decided to respond and come in. And, I'd called in a lot of elk up to that point, and I'd had shot opportunities up to that point that just hadn't connected. And this one came in, and if you bow hunted back in the late 80s, early 90s, you'll remember the rangefinders were about that big, and they had a button on them, and they were like binoculars, but twice as big and heavy. And I had a set of those, and I remember pulling them up and ranging across there. And I want to say it was 43 yards, if I remember correctly. And there was this patch of brush there, and the bull was coming down the ridge, and I ranged that patch of brush at 43 yards. Bull came through that patch of brush, stepped out on the other side, and bugled right there. And I drew back, and fortunately, I as I look back now, I didn't spend near enough time preparing for those kind of encounters. And fortunately, this time I settled in, had good enough form to be able to see my pin through there and put a pin on the spot and pulled the trigger. But again, this was the first elk that I had ever shot and killed. And when the shot went off, I thought, I don't even know if I hit it or not. Just so much happens right then. But I'll never forget walking up there. I walked up to where the bull was standing. There was no blood or anything. It was right at dark. I had maybe 15 minutes of shooting light left, and I thought, I'm by myself. I need to back out. I don't even know if I hit this elk. I'll back out and come back in the morning and look for it. And so I came back the next morning right at daylight, couldn't find anyone to come with me. And I went back and went about 40 yards, and the bull was laying there dead. So, lesson learned on that one. I definitely should have looked for blood. I should have followed up on that because the bull was there. But then the real lesson came. That was the first elk I ever had to pack out solo, ever had to cut up and pack out solo. And that was a chore. It took most of the day to get that elk cut up. And it was really maybe 400 yards below the skid road I'd driven in on. But, that for me, that kind of, the fire had been lit, but then it was like, okay, I can do this. Now I need to figure out how to do it consistently. But I think, so many people get discouraged when they aren't successful the first season or two out. And I tell that as a story to inspire people that it's supposed to be hard. It's not going to come the first year, especially on a consistent basis, and stick with it. And once you figure it out, it becomes easier and easier. You gain more and more confidence, and hopefully you can string it together in a way that becomes more consistent after that first one or that second or third one.
That's awesome, man. What a good podcast, Corey. Thank you so much for coming on. Um, where can we find you? You want to pump your stuff? Now you got Elk 101, right? And What do we got going on?
Yeah, so elk101.com is a website. We've got, presence on social media. My personal social is just CoreyJacobson.elk101. And then we created the University of Elk Hunting online course, and that's a really good resource for people to take them from never elk hunting before to success, or to take you from, you know, maybe you've hunted for 10 years and not killed one, or just killed a couple and you want to become more consistent. There's a lot of really good content in there. It's part of Outdoor Class now, so you can find the University of Elk Hunting at outdoorclass.com, and that's kind of those are my platforms.
That's awesome, man. Let's do it again. Thank you, Corey.
I'd be happy to, and best of luck in Colorado this fall.
I'm gonna send you a picture of a big old bull that I killed.
Can't wait.